Okay, I think we're ready to go, sort of. Usual technical problems. I'm Ned Alpers, and I'm very honored to be the chair of this panel. We have 5 distinguished presenters that each have about 15 minutes so that we don't go way past our bedtimes. And so I'm just going to introduce each individual and her or his paper, and then when they finish, I'll do the same for the following person. Our first speaker this evening is Emma Christopher, who's about to take up a prestigious 4-year Scientia Fellowship at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. She's the author of 3 previous books and many articles on aspects of the transatlantic slave trade, and her new book, Freedom in Black and White, The Illegal Slave Trade and Its Global Legacy, is forthcoming later this year. She's also the director, producer, and writer of the feature documentary, They Are We, which won 5 Best Documentary Awards, screened in 74 countries around the world, and was hailed as an inspiration of victory over slavery by then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Her paper is entitled, The Coast Swarms with Slave Ships, I think. Is that what your paper is now called?
Yes.
Okay, good. You never know. Slave Trading and Captives After Abolition. So.
Oh, no, that's his.
Oh, that's not what it's, okay, so yours is Beyond the Atlantic Crossing?
No, mine is called The Ship's Swans. It's his paper.
Whatever I've got in the program is not quite right. So why don't you come up and introduce your title?
It's the same.
So what else is new?
No, the paper hasn't changed. It's just that we have the wrong presentation there. So.
Do you have slides that need to go on?
I do.
Yes,
They're
she
right
does.
here. I can.
Did he get them loaded on there?
Yeah.
Yeah, they've got- yeah.
They should all be here. Okay. That's better. Okay.
We'll keep time.
Yes, because I don't have a watch. That would be great. Okay. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you very much to Tyler Stovall for inviting me. Someone is telling me they can't hear me at the back. Is that better? Can hear me? Okay. In 1820, 7 years after their traumatic experiences together in a slave factory in what is today Liberia, a man named Tamba spoke to those with whom he had arrived into forced exile. The Lord brought us from a long country, he said. Many of us came together. Now, this is not especially surprising, this mention of people as shipmates who'd arrived together. But there's a couple of things that we know about this case which come from the extraordinary documentation that surrounds it. The first thing I know is that Tamba was a Kissi man. The name Tamba is given by Kissi and Kono women to their second-born sons, as some of you will know. But he'd arrived with a group of people who were very mixed. Only a few of them were also Kissi. The hinterland of the Wibwood coast, as you see there, is a patchwork of an incredible number of ethnic groups, most of which survive today, a few of which don't. They are not limited to, but the ones I could come up with off the top of my head, the Timni, the Mendi, Bandi, Vai, Loma, Bonth, Loco, Day, Banta, Gola, Mabanta, Pele, Manding, Fulla, the Karanko, the Sherbro, and the Kono, as well as the Kissi. So when he was talking about we've all come together from a long country, this is very much an invention, a new identity that he's coming up with. What's also particularly intriguing about this is that Tamba himself had not been a captive in the slave trading business, where the others, the ones he's now calling his shipmates, had been imprisoned awaiting sale. Tamba had been enslaved as a small boy, but had grown up, as others described it, in the slave trade. He'd worked for his owners, the Corker and the Cleveland families who ruled the Banana Islands, as you can see there on the map, at various times as they'd fought and they'd handed him backwards and forwards at least twice. He then belonged to Robert Bostock, a British man. He's the son of a well-known Liverpool slave trader of the same name. Those of you who've read documents that talk about Robert Bostock, this is his son. And the Bostock family, but the son Bostock had married into the Corker family around 1803. And after the illegal of the slave trade by the British and American governments in 1807 and 8, instead of going home, he upped the stakes. Bostock had taken Tamba and some other slaves he owned, and had gone first to Gallines, and then to Cape Mesurado, setting up illicit slaving enterprises with his American business partner, Charles Mason, who was connected in some way that I've never totally pinned down to the dwarfs of Rhode Island. So the reason I want to start with this is because when Tamba talks about we've all come together, we're all from this one place, he's clearly making some kind of regional identity in the way that, for example, Walter Hawthorne talks about from the Upper Guinea coast. But because of the extraordinary documentation in this case, what I can actually trace backwards is that a lot of these people had known each other from before the Barracoon. Those of you that work in Sierra Leone will be, that is unbelievably the contract with the chief setting up the factory where Tamba worked. As you can see, the name at the top is Siaka, the guy who dealt the Amistad slaves. There is the contract for their second, that's a copy of the contract, for their second factory down at Cape Mesurado. These are the liberated African lists, which some of you will be familiar with the names roughly transcribed by an African clerk and then a British clerk as well. And what's interesting is if you follow these backwards in the style kind of pioneered by Philip Misovich, you can find that some of them had clearly known each other from before. And this is backed up not just by tracing the names, but by what Tamba and the census and the other people say about these people. So I can say, for example, that there was almost certainly a set of twins who were likely identical twins. There was a group of people who had, in all probability, come from one single raid on a village or possibly a group of contiguous villages. And what he's actually saying when Tamba says we came together, he is actually arguing against the ones who are Manding and Fuller, who have tried to keep their Islamic faith and saying, no, now we need to be Christian. This is who we are. So the reason I want to begin with Tamba to focus on how the illegalization of the slave trade shifted the nature of the horrific experience of Africans caught in its web, and to follow this back into Africa as well as across the ocean. I was originally going to look at a much wider picture, but then I thought that in this very short time allowed, perhaps I should just look at one small bit of the coast. And Gallines is particularly appropriate, not just because it was a sort of model illegal slave port in some ways, not least because of the Amistad connection, but it was because it was a primary focus of the abolitionists and the British naval patrol's ire in these years. It was Gallines when they raged that the coast swarms with slave ships. And I also think that this paper, in a way, follows on from the two panels that have already been today about new directions in the slave trade, particularly the work of Jorge Felipe, who's looking at where people came into Cuba, where they came from in the Americas. It's kind of a way of tracing that backwards. And it's often said that slaves on vast plantations in Cuba or Brazil, with far less direct supervision from those of European origin, had entirely different opportunities and reasons to preserve, to transform, or to hybridize the cultures they carried with them from Africa. But what I actually want to explore is how the actual business practices of the illegal era also affected the grouping and or the dissemination of different ethnic groups. So Gallines had not been a major slave trading port before abolition because of the extremely rough surf. It doesn't look very rough on there, but you can see that it is very rough, actually. But you can see that on one side is the Atlantic, and on the other side, just at the back there, you can see incredibly calm mangrove creeks. That's a better picture of the Mangrove Creek, which is totally different to the Atlantic coastline. So the reason that it had never been popular before was because it's not a real port. Doesn't have a natural harbour. And because the sea is very rough, the surf is very rough. But once the trade was illegalized, it became incredibly attractive to illegal slave traders because merchants and planters could send out smaller, faster craft from Havana or Matanzas or San Luis de Maranhão. And if they sailed at just the right moment, they could get over that sea bar at high tide, and then they were safe in the very calm water behind. The British naval patrol ships are bigger. They can't get over. So if the small ships can get over, they're pretty much able to do, to be there peacefully loading the captives aboard. In fact, this place was so popular that within a decade, as many slaves would be shipped from Galenas in a single year has departed in the entire century to 1800. They left on smaller vessels, often more cramped than what had gone before, and as Benjamin Lawrence has shown, a lot of them were children. That's also backed up in this case, where about 2/3 are under the age of 16. Now, such a precipitous rise in slave trading at Galenas saw a fundamental change in the lives of those living in the hinterland of the Windward Coast. Just to give one example, the Loma people lost so many of their kin to slave raiders that they began changing their whole way of life. They'd always lived in small hamlets, but they began moving to bigger settlements for protection. The Vai, whose land Galenas was within, became much more serious slave traders themselves. And others sought safety in fascinating multi-ethnic alliances, like the Kondo Federation, which Sven Halso wrote about some decades ago. Founded by the Loma, the Day, and Bande men, soon Pele, Gola, Vai, and Manding people also joined, hoping to save themselves by being part of a group strong enough to partially control the trade, which is, of course, what the Vai were trying to do as well. But it isn't just this confederation that leads to questions about how the slave trade, after illegalization, led to the melding and adapting of ethnic identifications in ways that seem to defy DNA, or at least easy DNA analysis today. The Banta, for example, who I've studied for some years now, had originally been part of the Timni people, but had separated from the main Timni group when they moved south to try and protect themselves from slave raiding during the legal era, when Bon's Island, which is just inland from Freetown there, not inland. So they moved south to try and protect themselves. And over the 2 centuries they were there in rough safety, they had become known as a separate ethnic group and had that self-identity that they were different people. But soon they were so utterly destroyed by the Mendi, whose identification in this era was itself in flux, that those who were left assimilated into the Mendi, mostly forcibly, obviously. In fact, it suggested that it was this assimilation that led to this group of people being called Bar Mendi, or the different Mendi. Now, it might seem that the Banta were no closer to Galenas than they had been to Bon's Island, but the new realities meant that much more fly-by-night operations. There were no big structures like Bon's Island, definitely nothing like on the coast of Ghana today, nor even the large complex that Pedro Blanco built up a couple of decades later. There was nothing like this. So those new slaving ports hidden among the mangrove creeks led to new pathways to the ocean, which you can see there, the problem for the Banta, that they can be snuck around. And I was just saying to somebody earlier today that I actually drove down from the Banta, where the Banta are now, to the coast to look at that river there, because it shows that it can't be, it's even on maps, it's not really there. It's as if people have decided that, people have written that you can't take them down that coast, down that river. But that is the river. I'm pretty sure you can move people down there. Now, I'm running out of time, but what I guess I'm trying to say is that what I'm trying to figure out is what happens if you take, for example, the oral traditions of one group of people, all the documents, a kind of anthro-historical viewpoint, as it were, and mix them together and try and figure out what does that tell us about the old questions of roots and roots. What what does it lead to if you look at these groups of people that came out together? Because, of course, it's much, as I haven't got to the part of the paper, I won't talk about that, but the planters mostly in Cuba, the people sending them in this era, and they are chartering vessels. So if you are caught in a raid in the Banterlands and you go out on one vessel, you are on one plantation or on a contiguous plantation. Now, I'm not in any way trying to make a case that that was less horrific than what had gone before. It's very, very clear that it was not. But I am trying to figure out if in some way, if we all did micro studies to the coast, we couldn't figure out much more about the grouping of ethnicities and self-identities and how those shift in the Americas as a result of the new business practices that take place as people try and hide and dodge from the naval patrols, and the totally different business model that takes place after 1808.
Excellent, thank you.
Emma has just done something I've never experienced in 50 years in the academy. I gave her the 5-minute sign and she finished before 5 minutes. It's never happened before, so. Our next speaker is Janet Ewald. Jan is an associate professor of history at Duke University. Her first book examined the history of a Sudanese kingdom in the northeast Nuba Hills, including the slave trade into the Indian Ocean. She has published several important essays on labor in the Indian Ocean world and is currently working on a manuscript called Bondsmen, Freedmen, and Contract Workers, the Development of Captive Maritime Labor in the Indian Ocean, 1610 to 1900. And her paper is on the slavery and slave trade in the Western Indian Ocean from about 1770 to 1890.
Switch to your computer, right? Yeah. So let's go.
This one? Yeah.
Do you want the power?
I don't think so.
Good.
Just what else?
Okay, am I?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. My screen looks a little weird, but Can I make that bigger? Okay, thank you for that nice introduction, Ned. And thanks to my fellow panelists for their participation and members of the audience for their presence. Okay. In roughly the century between 1770 and 1880, more Africans than ever before, probably more than 1.7 million, made forced voyages on the Western Indian Ocean. During this span, slave exports increased along the entire, I can't see my own images. Shoot. Yep, on the entire African coast from the Red Sea in the north to Maputo Bay beyond the Limpopo River in the south. And that would be from northern Sudan to southern Mozambique. All this area of the coast supplied slaves in larger and smaller numbers. Okay. Africans disembarked, after embarking from the coast, Africans disembarked in 4 continents. The most important destinations were the Americas, the Mascarene Islands, the Arabian Peninsula, and other parts of southwestern Asia, Cuba, and Brazil. Okay, how did this increase begin, and what sustained it? Before pursuing these questions, I'd like to orient you to the slave trade in the Western Indian Ocean, and at the same time, interrogate the map that gives you that information. This map probably looks familiar to you. It's from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. It's a wonderful map. I'm not going to criticize it. I use it all the time when I teach. However, like all maps in the service of conveying some information, it neglects or obscures other information. For example, it squishes about 400 years of development into big lines. It makes the northern circuit and the southern circuit of the Western Indian Ocean look completely separate, as if they never merged, joined, or intertwined. It's easy to forget that these two slave trades were very different, but it's easy to forget that differentiation does not necessarily result from mutual isolation. In fact, differentiation and interaction can go together. I discovered this when I started to work on the northwestern Indian Ocean trade. I started in the Nile Valley and then got pulled into the northwestern Indian Ocean. And then in the northwestern Indian Ocean, I kept on getting pulled, much to my dismay, because it complicated things, farther and farther south towards the southern circuit of the slave trade. I realized at some point I'm looking for the little, no. There should be a green blob. Is there a green blob behind? No, there isn't? Okay. Okay. I realized at some point that Zanzibar in the northwestern Indian Ocean, at the very height of its slave exports, received 80% of its own captives from Kilwa, which is right on the borderline between the northern and southern circuits of the slave trade. In turn, the hinterland behind Kilwa also supplied captives to Mozambique Island, and those captives generally embarked for the Mascarenes or the Americas. So in other words, what looks as if it was a line of separation was actually an area of interaction. And people in the hinterland of Kilwa or Mozambique Island could go either way. They could go to the Americas, or they could go to Southwest Arabia, or Southeastern Arabia, or Southern Arabia, or they could end up on the Swahili coast. There wasn't a boundary between the two systems as far as they were concerned. Okay. The map emphasized the difference between the two slave trades, and those of us who teach and study the northwestern Indian Ocean slave trade tend to perpetuate this difference with some good reasons. I always tell my students, or anybody who will listen, that slavery and enslavement in the northwestern Indian Ocean differed a great deal than the same phenomenon in the Atlantic world. I emphasize how the northwestern Indian Ocean was bound by the exchange of commodities other than slaves for centuries before the Atlantic slave trade, and how people other than Africans were enslaved and traded in that system. Okay. My paper is going to do two things. It's first going to illuminate the entanglements between the northern circuit of the slave trade and the southern circuit of the slave trade, and then it's going to shift gears and go and look at the hinterland and what processes there sustained the slave trade. Okay, if we look at, this is the slave trade as it existed between about 1500 and 1670. That's what it says, yes?
No?
See, I can't see on my screen what's going on
You,
the,
hold on,
maybe you can,
I'll be your eyes.
yeah. I wonder how I should do this.
This is the, okay, you got it, back up one. That's it.
Ah, that says 1500 to 1670?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Okay. The first thing I want to emphasize is at the same time the Portuguese entered the Indian Ocean from the south, migrants, traders, and religious adepts entered the western Indian Ocean from the north and settled along the old trading settlements that had been established on the coast and on northwestern Madagascar for a number of centuries. These people, beginning in 1500 and with no apparent influence of Europeans, began to trade extensively in goods from the interior, mainly ivory and gold, and from slaves mainly from Madagascar. At this point, no extensive slave trading routes penetrated into the interior, at least according to the most recent scholarship on the Swahili coast. You'll notice a number of interesting things here. One is that how central the island of Madagascar is. Captives from Madagascar went in all directions, to India, to Southeast Asia, to Cape Town, and to the Atlantic world, especially Barbados. You'll also know that the two major slave supplying areas in Africa were Ethiopia in the north and the island of Madagascar in the south. In the 17th century, too, well, I should back up a little bit. In 1650, migrants from Oman entered this system, following people from southern Arabia, and essentially insinuated themselves in the trade networks, taking captives from Madagascar and commodities from the interior of Africa. Oman, because of its close links to India and because of its extensive maritime activity, formed sort of a fulcrum between the cloth production in India and ivory production in Africa. At the same time that the Omanis arrived along the coast of Africa, new groups of Europeans, the French, the Dutch, and the English came. Europeans traded slaves in the Western Indian Ocean in all directions. They took Southeast Asians to Cape Town. They took people from Madagascar to Cape Town, to India, all over. So the slave trade is going in European vessels, is going in many different directions. I would argue, though, that this early period was a formative period in which the trade infrastructure within the interior was established, not so much to bring slaves, but rather to bring ivory and gold. In addition, Madagascar became very important to Europeans as it had been, and still was, to traders from the Arabian Peninsula. At about 1770, plantation agriculture I'll skip ahead here. So, does it say, Cherka 1775. In 1770, plantation agriculture in the Mascarenes began to develop very, very rapidly, largely because of the collapse of the Compagnie des Indes and the opening of enterprises in the Mascarenes to private entrepreneurs. So the slave trade increased greatly. And at this time in particular, we see very, very sort of close interactions among Afro-Arab communities, well, not the communities themselves, but we see French traders going to both Afro-Arab communities, such as Zanzibar and Kilwa, for slaves for the Mascarenes, as well as to Mozambique, Mozambique Island for captives for the same destination. In other words, again, captives from, well, for the first time perhaps, captives from the central area could end up in a number of different destinations. And I have to note here that Ned Alpers wrote the the seminal article about the influence of the French slave trade in stimulating the slave trade in other parts of Africa, including the northwestern Indian Ocean in, if you don't mind my saying, 1970?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that, yeah. Okay. So this increase in the demand for captives in the French Mascarenes, and then until the Haitian Revolution in Saint-Domingue, followed by the growth of the second slavery, especially in Cuba and Brazil, continued to sustain the southern circuit. I can do this, thank you. The southern circuit of the slave trade. Okay. But what we still need to understand is how people were made slaves in the interior and how they were trafficked to the coast. And for this, we have to go to another aspect of the Atlantic world. Not so much the Atlantic slave trade itself, but rather, well, actually, first India. First, merchant capitalism in India, and then industrial capitalism in the North Atlantic. Beginning in 1750, because of the growth of cloth production in Gujarat, the market for ivory in India expanded. Indian merchants went to the coast of Africa. Well, sometimes they went, sometimes they worked through middlemen, with cloth in order to exchange for ivory. Africans in the interior valued cloth a great deal and opened trade routes going to the coast, more trade routes than ever before, going to the coast to bring ivory for which they exchanged for cloth. Another Atlantic connection here is in Madagascar. When slave traders purchased slaves in Madagascar, they used American silver. And when they purchased slaves in Mozambique, they used American silver to buy cloth from Indian merchants, which they then used to buy slaves. So you see this kind of, again, sort of emerging between the two systems. Okay, so by the time the French arrived on the coast, new trading routes had been opening for the previous 2 decades. The ivory trade continued to expand into the coast. First, the Indian demand continued, and after 1820, the main market for ivory became North America and the United Kingdom. The slave trade rode parasitically into the interior on the ivory trade. People did not leave the coast of Africa and march into the interior in search of slaves. They were after ivory. But the organization of the ivory trade, large-scale enterprises, caravans, encouraged local trade. Porters and armed guards in caravans were given trade goods, bolts of cloth, in exchange for their labor. They then engaged in local and regional trade. They traded salt from one part of the interior to another, artisanal products, and also people, okay? So people entered, the slave trade entered with the ivory trade, and in a way slaves were kind of, as one scholar put it, the small change of the ivory trade. Expensive cloth and tusks were, the $100 bills, and people and small bolts of calico, small pieces of calico were the small change. Okay, but why did Africans give up people to enter the ivory trade? The cloth and the beads and the metal goods and the guns that Europeans could get cheaply in exchange for expensive ivory were both prestige goods and currencies in the African societies in the interior. This meant that ambitious people, if their ambition was something as big as political aggrandizement or just getting married, needed to have these prestige goods. In order to gain prestige goods, young men, youths, would join caravans and engage in the slave trade, but people who needed prestige goods often went into debt to wealthier people. When the debts were called in and they couldn't pay them, they had to pawn the labor of themselves or their dependents, and these people entered the slave trade. So it was really the impact of the goods of industrial capitalism, especially the cloth and the metal goods, on the political economies of the hinterland of Indian Ocean Africa that gave the slave trade its dynamism. And in the 19th century, the slave trade in, especially the northwestern Indian Ocean, became systemic in a way that it never had been before. And the irony about this to me is that there's something very tragic but also magisterial about the Atlantic slave trade. Slaves produced the goods that allowed for the industrialization, modernization, or progress in Western Europe, right? That's one of the arguments that's been made. In Indian Ocean Africa, what did Indians and Europeans and North Americans want? Ivory, furniture polish, cloves, pearls, these discretionary goods that nurtured the slave trade. And there's something almost Conrad-esque about that. So I guess in a way I'm going back to, in some ways, these two slave trades kind of came together. In other ways, they really diverged in terms of kind of their affective and historical importance and content. So thank you very much. And I know I probably went over that.
Thank you, Jan. Our next speaker is Greg O'Malley. Greg's Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His first book, Final Passages, The Intercolonial Slave Trade of British America, 1619 to 1807, received 4 awards. We've just heard the Forkosh Prize for British History from the AHA, also the Raleigh Prize for Atlantic History. the Owsley Award from the Southern Historical Association, and the Gouveia Prize from the Association of Caribbean Historians. Truly remarkable garnering of prizes. He is currently co-principal investigator with Alex Barucki for the NEH-funded Final Passages, the Intra-American Slave Trade Database, and there were the linked panels that I know many of you attended earlier today. His paper is Beyond the Atlantic Crossing, Reckoning with Captives, Multi-Stage Journeys Through the Slave Trade. Greg?
Get mine plugged back in here. I think we're in business. You've seen this one before, but now we're ready for it. Okay, so, well, thank you for that introduction. Thanks also to AHA President Tyler Stovall for the invitation to participate in this great panel. Scholarship on the Atlantic slave trade, whether quantifying the forced migration, assessing the profits of traders, or examining experiences of the captives, has a tendency to focus on the Atlantic crossing. The infamous phrase, the Middle Passage, which refers specifically to the voyage from the African coast to the Americas, is often used interchangeably with the slave trade, as if the whole sordid business were encapsulated in just the transatlantic sail. For example, a textbook I use in a class I teach ends its section on the Atlantic slave trade with the sentence, quote, "When slave ships finally reached New World ports, they reeked of disease and excrement," period. Then a heading and a new subject, as if the slave trade were over the instant transatlantic vessels, quote, "finally reached New World ports." And the textbook's accompanying primary sources include excerpts from Olaudah Equiano's harrowing description of surviving the slave trade, as so many textbooks do. And here as well, the spotlight on just the Atlantic crossing is evident. The excerpt begins with Equiano's first sighting of a slave ship on the African coast and ends with his recounting of the squalor and horror in the ship's hold during the crossing of the Atlantic. His multi-staged African journey before being sold to Europeans is entirely left out, as are his many references to intra-American slave trading after the Middle Passage. Because actually, after landing in Barbados, Equiano reported that the traders in charge of his sail landed he and his fellow captives and took them to a merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together like so many sheep in a fold for a fortnight. Then he went on to relate that I and some few more slaves that were not saleable amongst the rest were shipped off in a sloop for North America, end quote. And later in his life, Equiano also described working aboard numerous vessels that engaged in such intra-American slave trading. Yet my textbook, like most others, I think, leaves all that out to keep the focus squarely on the Atlantic crossing. That's the sort of familiar slave trade story that mostly we tell, especially when we get to a point of synthesizing for students. And I don't point this out to castigate the textbook, because I think its fixation on the Atlantic crossing mostly reflects the fixations of historians in general and the scholarship on the slave trade. To give just one example for now, we're going to do another map from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database seeks to document every voyage that ferried enslaved African women and men across the ocean from Africa to the Americas, but it excludes intra-African movements and intra-American movements from its coverage. For full disclosure, of course, in arguing for examinations of the slave trade that are more inclusive of the intra-African and intra-American phases, I'm partly just arguing for the significance of my own research, which to date has focused almost entirely on the intra-American slave trade. And it's important to note that all the tremendous scholarship on the transatlantic portion of the slave trade over the past several decades is absolutely essential to me being able to do the work that I do, and that's true for many other scholars working on other aspects of the slave trade. I should also add that historians of the transatlantic portion of the slave trade have been uniformly receptive and supportive to calls from me and other scholars of the intra-American traffic to take that portion of the slave trade seriously. In fact, thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the receptiveness of David Eltis and his collaborators on the Transatlantic Database, we expect to go live later this year with a new intra-American slave trade database on the very website that hosts the Transatlantic Database, slavevoyages.org. So my goal for this talk is not really to convince slave trade specialists to take the intra-American portion of the slave trade seriously. Instead, I'm hoping to convey to a broader historical community, teachers of surveys and writers of textbooks, why the multiple phases of the Atlantic slave trade, not just the ocean crossing, are so important. And I'm just going to emphasize two main aspects: the importance for understanding captive experiences and the utility of the intra-American slave trade, to some degree the intra-African, but I'll focus more on the American side, the utility of it for illustrating the pervasiveness of the slave system. Now, first, the most obvious implication of looking beyond just the ocean crossing in our examination of the slave trade is that the journeys captives endured were much longer than the month or two of crossing the ocean, with implications more far-reaching than one might initially suspect. In Africa, virtually all victims of the slave trade endured considerable forced migration within Africa prior to the Middle Passage. Likewise, many survivors of the Atlantic crossing did not settle on plantations in proximity to the port of their arrival. Some marched vast distances inland, some boarded yet other ships for maritime journeys between colonies. By tallying such forced migrations from port records, I estimate that 1 in 5 captives landing in a British colony from Africa was purchased not by a person planning to put them to work, but rather by a merchant speculator who moved them for resale over considerable distance in the Americas. More anecdotally, accounts from slave trade survivors give a similar impression. In Jerome Handler's analysis of 14 known narratives from survivors of the Middle Passage to British America, 6 of the 14, or nearly half, described additional long-distance movements within 3 weeks of first landing in the Americas. So how does this change things? For one thing, the journeys were simply longer than we sometimes think. On the African end, James Albert Ukosa-Graniusod described his journey before sale to Europeans this way: I cannot recollect how long we were in going from Borno, where he was born, to the Gold Coast, but it was tedious in traveling so far by land, being upwards of 1,000 miles. Unless you think he was exaggerating about those 1,000 miles, here's a Google map that backs him up. Corroborates his memory of the distance. Voyages within the Americas after surviving the Middle Passage could also cover vast distances. A journey like the one Equiano described from Barbados to Virginia was commonplace. That's a sail of several weeks on the heels of the Middle Passage. Perhaps the most dramatic examples come from the Southern Hemisphere, where many captives bound for Peru faced longer journeys within the Americas than they had endured to cross the ocean. Some captives traveled to Peru overland from Cartagena, more than 2,000 miles march. Others marched across the Isthmus of Panama for yet another sea voyage, this time on the Pacific. Another route to colonial Peru went through the Rio de la Plata. Angolan men and women on this route often first landed in the Americas in southern Brazil, only to board new vessels for a sail down the coast to a Spanish port. The map shows it overland, but that's not, usually this was seaborne traffic. Traders then often marched the enslaved overland from Buenos Aires across today's Argentina and over the Andes, a journey of nearly 3,000 kilometers to Potosí, or about 4,000 kilometers to Lima. Such longer journeys are meaningful beyond just duration and imagined suffering. Think about mortality. I imagine that most people in this room are familiar with the horrifying statistic calculated from known transatlantic voyages that approximately 1 in 5 people aboard a slave ship who boarded a ship on the coast of Africa did not survive to reach America. A horrific 20% of captives perished at sea. But as gruesome as that finding is, it vastly underestimates the murderousness of the slave trade. Historians of the slave trade in Africa, such as Patrick Manning, Paul Lovejoy, John Thornton, have long made the point that the enslavement processes in Africa, small-scale raids and full-scale wars, were deadly ones. The overland and riverine journeys that then delivered the captives from those wars and raids to ports of trade with Europeans also took their toll. The horrors of the Middle Passage are more widely known among historians, and then I would suggest that intra-American trafficking only compounded the deadliness of this migration. The journeys were often shorter in the intra-American trade, but most captives had only recently survived the pestilent Middle Passage, so they often embarked on intercolonial journeys already weakened, weary, and ill. The exhausted captives embarking on such intra-American ventures, it is perhaps unsurprising that rates of mortality I've calculated for the intra-American trade are even higher than the rates of mortality aboard transatlantic journeys. But what I really want to emphasize is that such comparison is not really the point. For the captives in the slave trade, the effect was cumulative. Those fortunate enough to survive capture and movement within Africa had to survive the Atlantic crossing, and even then they had not necessarily escaped death and disease, because an intra-American voyage might be waiting to test their endurance again. Now, beyond the suffering and perseverance of individual captives, looking beyond just the Atlantic crossing can also help us and our students understand the pervasiveness of the slave system. The expanding reach of the slave trade ever deeper into Africa demonstrates the system's growth over time as slave raiders searched farther afield for their prey. And on the American side of the Atlantic, intercolonial forced migrations pushed the slave system outward from the main ports of arrival from Africa, Kingston, Jamaica, Willemstad, Curaçao, Salvador da Bahia, to all manner of other locations, ones that often don't immediately come to most people's minds when they think of African slavery: Mexico City, New York, Venezuela. Furthermore, looking beyond just the Atlantic crossing to all phases of the slave trade also affects our understanding of profits. Historians have long debated how profitable the slave trade was. Caribbean historian and later Prime Minister of Trinidad, Eric Williams, famously argued that the profits of the slave trade fueled British industrialization. But many economists dismiss this, saying that comparisons of prices paid for captives in Africa and prices received for them in America, especially if one factors in shipping costs, made the profits small compared to the overall economies of these slave trading empires. Yet Stan Engerman and other economic historians have tended to focus only on the profits of buying slaves on the African coast and selling them upon reaching the Americas. But factoring in other phases of the slave trade complicates matters. Most simply, there were additional rounds of buying and selling. People weren't bought and sold once, but serially, with successive rounds of traders, each taking their profit at that stage. Perhaps even more important, a main argument in my book is that the intercolonial phase of the slave trade was entangled with other commerce, where transatlantic slave traders typically carried only human captives from Africa to the Americas. Intra-American slave traders often mixed that slave trading with the trading of goods. In fact, many felt that slave trading facilitated their commerce in goods. So to give just one example, in North Carolina in 1749, there was a glut of shipping. Too many ships, not enough goods to fill them. So a merchant there named James Murray warned partners in the Caribbean not to ship goods to North Carolina, with one caveat. He said, quote, "If necessity obliges you to come, I advise you to bring, instead of rum and sugar, some cheap Negroes, but not old ones. If anything brings a loading here, they will," end quote. In other words, having enslaved people to sell brought trade partners to the table when nothing else could. In that environment, where did the profits from slave trading end and the profits from other commerce begin? You need to trade slaves to get into the other commerce, exporting goods from North Carolina. And it wasn't only individual merchants who understood the slave trade as uniquely valuable in this way. The British government supported British traders in shipping enslaved Africans from British to Spanish colonies because such slave sales facilitated exports of British manufactured goods. The slave trade held promise in this regard because it was the one traffic for which Spain granted exceptions to their trade restrictions for Spanish America. Trading enslaved people got British traders into Spanish America, and then they could engage in other commerce on the sly. As one British strategist explained it, from Jamaica, quote, "A trade was opened with the Spaniards and successfully carried on for Negroes and other merchandise, whereby great quantities of the manufactures of Great Britain were yearly vended." And despite the fact that slave trading was essential for permission to access Spanish ports, he continued, quote, "The trade carried on for Negroes was likewise the least branch of their commerce," end quote. So they made more money selling other goods, but the slave trade got them in the door. Or as another British leader would put it, almost a century later, understanding the trade in the same way, quote, "A trade to the Spanish Main for British manufactures is covered wholly by a few slaves, and the trade dependent altogether on that share in the assortment," end quote. So the profits of other commerce, and I would point out specifically the profits of the burgeoning manufacturing sector at the start of Britain's Industrial Revolution, were bolstered by the intercolonial trade in slaves. These English goods were coming into Jamaica, enslaved Africans were coming into Jamaica, and then they're putting together mixed cargoes and using the slaves to get them in to sell the manufactured goods. So to understand the Atlantic slave trade, the captive experiences, the profits of the business, or the cultural ramifications in the African diaspora, I think it's vital that historians continue to look beyond just the Atlantic crossing to understand the slave trade more holistically, including all of its phases. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, you're just going to read it, right? You're not using the computer. You're not using it. Yes, okay.
Well, our next scheduled speaker was Dale Tomich, who's professor of sociology and deputy director of the Fernand Braudel Center at Binghamton University, Dale is the author of Slavery in the Circuit of Sugar, Martinique and the World Economy, 1830 to 1848, Through the Prism of Slavery, Labor, Capital, and World Economy, and he's currently working on a collaborative international project on the making of plantation spaces in 19th century Cuba, Brazil, and the U.S. South. I think it's also telling how much current work going on in the slave trade is, in fact, and slavery is collaborative. Unfortunately, Dale had a health situation. His physician advised him not to travel to D.C., not a bad decision given the weather in New York. But we are fortunate because his paper is going to be read by Joe Miller. Joe Miller is, of course, a distinguished historian of the slave trade himself, the T. Carey Johnson Professor Emeritus at the University of Virginia, and the past president not only of the American Historical Association, but also of the African Studies Association. So, Joe.
I will pass your greetings on to Dale. He regretted very much not being able to be here. But it happens, as I look at the balance of expertise up here in front, it struck me that he was probably thought of, invited, because he is so well known for creating this field called the second slavery, which is essentially the 19th century revivification of slaving by growing industrialism, primarily in England. That's in the coffee in Brazil and the sugar in Cuba, and as Jan was saying, it extends out to the Indian Ocean as well. However, Dale is moving on, and so the paper this evening will be on the 17th century Brazil, and on a Jesuit father, Antonio Vieira. The title is Children of God's Fire, and I mention that because that's where the paper homes in. So I will read, and Ned, how long do I have?
15 minutes.
I think Dale was counting on more than 15 minutes. I'll do what I can. So historian Ira Berlin reminds us that race is a social construction of a specific kind. It's a historical construction rather than a biological constant. As a product of history, it cannot exist outside of time and place. It's continually formed and reformed in particular historical circumstances from historical methods, experiences, and relations particular to those moments. In this paper, he wants to explore the dynamics of racial formation in the context of the African slave trade and Brazilian slavery, in the Portuguese Atlantic, using an examination of the sermons of a Portuguese Jesuit, Antonio Vieira, whose dates 1608 to 1697 encapsulate the 17th century. Slave trading and the mass enslavement, primarily of Africans, as we know, was integral to the formation of Portugal's Atlantic Empire, above all to the sugar slave context that migrated from Madeira to São Tomé to Brazil between the late 15th and early 17th century. The formation of this complex entailed cross-cultural trade with various peoples and polities in sub-Saharan Africa, then the transportation of African captives across the Atlantic, and their sale in the Americas, and their subsequent socialization into the productive relations of slavery in plantations and mines in the New World. This transatlantic geohistorical complex marked a radical transition from the medieval Mediterranean world, the reciprocal slave raiding between Christians and Muslims. It was the constitutive moment of a historically unprecedentedly modern system of mass slavery and the slave trade. The creation of new categories and the relations of new categories of difference that sustained relations between white European masters and enslaved black Africans was central to the operation of Portuguese Atlantic slavery. My argument is that religious thought provided a rationale for their systematic enslavement of Africans. It formed the fundament of the political, social, and ideological culture of control that secured domination over enslaved Africans and legitimated the institution and brutal practices of the slave trade and slavery. However, white scholars have long been aware and have productively studied historical variations in racial categories and hierarchies among different societies. The question of what people perceive when they perceive difference has received less attention. Our contemporary conception of race appears anachronistic when applied to the early modern Portuguese Empire. Father Vieira's theological rationalization, I will say, of slavery was not based on the physical and cultural characteristics of enslaved Africans, but rather on their spiritual condition. He is tempted to call this racism without race. The physical serves as the marker for the metaphysical. The souls of black folk, in quotes, were literally Vieira's criteria for their social subordination. Father Vieira was arguably the leading intellectual figure of 17th century Portuguese Empire. He articulated a systematic interpretation that provided intellectual coherence and ideological justification for African slavery at a moment of multiple interlinked crises, secular and religious, of the Portuguese Atlantic system, flowing from the Renaissance, the Reformation, European discovery of the New World, and broadly speaking, what became the birth pangs of modernity. With the establishment of the sugar industry in the Brazilian Northeast at the end of the 16th century, Portugal consolidated an Atlantic empire of Atlantic proportions. However, at the same time, the Dutch West India Company both attempted to gain control over Portugal's slave trade in Africa and invaded Brazil. The Dutch challenge was both secular and religious. On the earthly side, the Dutch offensive threatened Portugal's domination of the South Atlantic and its slave sugar complex. On the other hand, the Protestant Dutch simultaneously challenged the ideological foundations of the Portuguese imperial project, the Catholic Church, and its claims to interpret the world and arbitrate relations among Christian nations, as well as the conversion of Africans to Catholicism under the aegis of Portuguese expansion. In Brazil, Vieira confronted a crisis that challenged his own cognitive framework. To use a concept proposed by Reinhard Koselleck, Vieira's intense, quote-unquote, field of experience with slavery was no longer integrated with his, quote, horizon of experience, that is, the religious meaning of the world imparted by the Bible and Catholic theology. Vieira operated within a late medieval framework. All of human history was interpreted within the Christian narrative arc running from the creation to the Last Judgment. The doctrine of last days circumscribed his horizon of expectation. For him, beginning anticipated the end, and the end realized the beginning. He interpreted secular practices and interests, that is his field of experience, through this religious lens. Prophecy, revelation, and symbolic meaning disclosed the hidden significance of events as experienced in Mediterranean climes. However, the systematic enslavement of Africans and their transportation to the New World introduced new phenomenon that went beyond this conceptual framework. The peoples of Africa were at best at the margins of the biblical narrative, and the Americans were beyond it altogether. The scale and intensity of African slavery as it developed in the Atlantic was also unprecedented. Vieira did not have categories to conceptualize the new conditions forming the Atlantic economy. So Vieira's effort to contain this fundamentally new field of experience within his limited horizon of expectation found expression in a well-known series of sermons under the title Maria Rosa Mystica. They were not simply a defense of Portugal's secular interests. Rather, their Tridentine and missionary character asserted the religious vocation of the Portuguese expansion, as well as church regulation of secular life in the face of the Protestant challenge. In this counter-Reformation context, it's plausible to view Vieira's eclectic and visionary reading of Scripture and his mystical, millennial, prophetic interpretation of events as an attempt to overcome his growing discomfort with the stark disparity between experience of suffering and expectations of salvation. In this regard, the exceptional nature of these sermons is more revealing of the moral tensions at play in the Portuguese Atlantic than any number of routine operational documents. Vieira's sermons are of particular interest because in them he created a comprehensive theological rationale, not for slavery in general, but specifically for the enslavement of Africans and Portugal's unique position in the Atlantic. In them, the sermons, the historical events of the Portuguese colonial expansion, the African slave trade, and slavery in Brazil are interpreted within the Catholic Church's eschatological arc of time. Capture in Africa is identified with spiritual birth, the Middle Passage with baptism, and enslavement on the sugar mills in northeastern Brazil with salvation. Prophecy is united with earthly history. Portugal is the instrument of divine will. The focal point of Vieira's justification of the enslavement of Black Africans is the crucifixion of Christ. Here, Vieira emphasized the presence of Mary, together with the Apostle John, at the foot of the cross. No way. Out of respect for our absent participant.
I know, I'm just doing my job.
I'm trimming Ned. All right. Vieira interpreted the crucifixion as a mystical event that is simultaneously the spiritual birth of Christ the Savior, of St. John the Evangelist, and of the blacks who are the children of Mary. Mary gives birth to all men, including outsiders and Gentiles. She becomes the universal mother of all who have faith and who recognize Christ. From Jesus' suffering at the cross, the blacks are also born as the children of Our Lady, to whom they are devoted. So the birth of Africans, thus children of cavalry, justifies their enslavement. They were spared divine punishment, but occupy the lowest rank among men. Vieira's identification of blacks with the humble descendants of the biblical ancestor to whom he attributes, I left that part out. All right, it's peculiar to him and anchors his mystical conception of salvation and of Africans anchored in their enslavement. Their black skin marks them not as descendants of Ham, but descendants of a companion of Moses called Korah. And that is their status as descendants of Korah is their spiritual destiny, not their physical features, that determines their earthly conditions. Moving right along, this mystical connection explains their spiritual birth from the special love of Mary at the foot of the cross. The spiritual birth of the children of cavalry, then, is their enslavement and transport to Brazil. And slavery in Brazil is their salvation. It is, and this is capitalized, miracle of divine providence and mercy. The transatlantic slave trade appears in Vieira's argument as the next step, then, along the path to salvation for the children of Calvary. Vieira praised the historically unprecedented flow of enslaved Africans that was passing continually from Africa to Brazil. The meaning Vieira finds in the experience elaborates his sharply dualistic conception of body and soul. Using the language of the trade, he declares that the slaves are called peças, which is Portuguese word for pieces, which was an unit of account in monetizing the value of the slaves' labor. So they're called peças because only their bodies can be enslaved, not their souls. The dominion of the master over the slave extends only to his body. Only the body can be bought and sold. The physical unit of labor is what is brought from Africa to Brazil and continues in captivity. Vieira argues that Our Lady of the Rosary has organized this first physical migration, which is of temporal enslavement, in order to prepare the enslaved for the second transmigration, which is the eternal liberty of the soul. He declares that the slaves, those whose bodies are branded with the hot iron, are the children of God's fire. And there's the title of the paper. The flames return. Vieira treats the sugar mill, that emblematic fiery engenho of the Brazilian sugar industry, as the exemplary site of their bondage and of their suffering. In his view, there's nothing on earth more like hell than any one of the fiery mills boiling cane juice down toward crystalline sugar in Brazil. The searing hot sugar mill has a spiritual significance for the enslaved Ethiopians. Perpetual suffering is their hereditary right and, quote, most extreme and exalted discipline. Their birth at Calvary preordains them to live in imitation of Christ's sufferings on the cross. And so the children of God's fire are chosen to suffer in their bondage. The clear and salvational separation of body and soul in Vieira's theological conception of slavery imposed temporal as well as spiritual obedience on the enslaved. Spiritual discipline of enduring earthly pain and unending labor is defined by their devotion to the Virgin Mary. The enslaved of the ingenues have the duty to serve, venerate, and invoke Mary through the rosary and through work. The mysteries of the rosary enable them to alleviate and sanctify their labor by offering it to her. As the children of the Mother of God, the enslaved are obligated to venerate and invoke during their hours of work, offering even a part of the rosary if they cannot pray it in its entirety. By praying and meditating on the painful mysteries of the rosary, the infernal of the sugar mill, its boiling cauldrons will be transformed into paradise. The deafening clatter will be transformed into celestial harmony. And the enslaved men, although they are black, into angels. So in these sermons, Vieira provided an ideological justification of the pain and suffering of the Portuguese Atlantic Empire and the African slave trade. At the same time, he articulated a comprehensive normative conception of slave submissiveness that legitimated the hardships of slavery and articulated a culture of control over the enslaved population in Brazil in the absence of a formal legal slave code and in the absence of an articulated conception of political economy. His theological constructions gave intellectual coherence and practical import to what Robin Blackburn has called Baroque slavery. They were challenged by Enlightenment conceptions of slavery and race. But these achievements were soon challenged elsewhere in the Atlantic by Enlightenment conceptions of slavery and race, formulated as part of the rise of the Anglo-Dutch and French colonial slavery, and the shift of the epicenter of the Atlantic sugar slave complex from Brazil to the Caribbean, already well underway by Vieira's day. Enlightenment constructions shifted the locus of difference between slaves and free from the soul to the physical and cultural characteristics of people from Africa and elsewhere. Viewed in the light of this transformation, this examination of Vieira's theological construction of new forms of slavery in Brazil points to the ways that the nexus of race and slavery was continually remade in the course of the historical processes radically restructuring the Atlantic world. On Dale's behalf, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is David Wheat. David's an associate professor of history at Michigan State University. His book, Atlantic Africa and the Spanish Caribbean, 1570 to 1640, was just awarded the AHA's James Raleigh Prize and the Lapidus Center's Harriet Tubman Prize. He's currently working with Mark Eagle on a history of the early transatlantic slave trade to Spanish America. And his talk is 16th century slave routes, Zapes and Magarabomba in the early Iberian Atlantic.
Right, well, first of all, I'd like to thank you all very much for being here at almost 9 o'clock, right?
And past 9 o'clock.
Oh, sorry, my bad. And also, thank you very much for the introduction. And also, again, echoing Greg, thank you to Tyler Stowell for the invitation to participate here in this panel. It's a real honor and privilege for me to be here. I want to start off with the 19th century, oddly enough. Founded as a ranch, or almost starting with the 19th century, founded as a ranch, or hato, in 1593, the town of Magarabomba in Camagüey province, Cuba, is today home to slightly less than 2,000 inhabitants. The 19th century Cuban historian Antonio Bachilleri Morales can hardly be blamed for supposing the town's name to have been of Native American origin. Major surges in the transatlantic slave trade, along with significant episodes of migration from China and the Yucatan, among other places, had drastically changed Cuba's demographic composition within his lifetime. By the mid-1800s, 43 of Magarabomba's 50 Spanish residents were in fact recent migrants from the Canary Islands. The 16th century, by comparison, must have seemed a relatively simpler time. It was not. A number of unsettling parallels can be found in the transatlantic slave trade from Sierra Leone to the Spanish Caribbean during the 16th and the 19th centuries. And historical advances over the past half-century now make it increasingly possible to examine the early Iberian slave trade from Sierra Leone in African and in broader Atlantic context. Okay. The best-known source for this mid-16th century slave trade, the Tratado Breve dos Rios de Guiné, was written by a Cape Verdean trader named André Álvares de Almada in about 1594, a year after the town as a ranch of Magarabomba was founded in Cuba. More than 40 years earlier, Almada wrote, Sierra Leone was invaded by an army known as the Manes, aided by their allies, the Sumbas. After burning towns and killing many of their inhabitants, known as the Zapes, according to Almada, the Manes promptly opened up, quote, butcheries for people, where they brought and killed the Zapes as if they were cows or rams to eat them. As the Manes and Sumbas destroyed one town after another, the Cape Verdean as they destroyed one town after another, Portuguese and Cape Verdean ships waited along the shores and riverbanks to pick up and enslave Zapes who were fleeing en masse from this invading army. Almada writes that upon seeing European or Luso-African traders, those who had been captured by the Manes, quote, clung to our people, begging and asking for the love of God that they purchased them in order to avoid being killed or eaten by the Manes Sumbas. And that, quote, many times a slave was exchanged for a belt or a red bonnet or a piece of cloth, end quote. Magarabomba, or Magarabomba, as Almada mentions in passing, was the name of one of Sierra Leone's many rivers. So how accurate, right, is this account, was Almada's account? After all, Europeans in this area were on the lookout for cannibals and giants, and cyclops, and islands inhabited by women and people with dogs' faces, right, among other ancient myths. But although he didn't witness the Mane invasions, Almada was a Cape Verdean person described as a mulatto, with extensive experience of trading on the Upper Guinea coast in the 1570s, 80s, and 90s. Modern scholars have disagreed as to when these Mane invasions happened, the 1550s perhaps, whether they were preceded by earlier invasions, the 1450s, or indeed whether they ever took place at all. And even more hotly debated literature on the supposed Jaga invasion of Congo in the late 1560s provides much useful food for thought, and I just learned from Joe that this debate has been resolved, which is news to me. But it's very relevant for thinking about the Mane invasions, which supposedly took place 10, 15, 20 years earlier, perhaps. So given this fairly extensive Spanish language documentation generated by slaving voyages from 16th century Sierra Leone, and Toby Green has already done some really useful work with some of these sources, the Mane invasions of Sierra Leone can be analyzed in the same fashion. So rather than thinking about comparing the Mane invasions to these Jaga invasions of Congo slightly later that may have never happened, as it turns out probably didn't really happen, we can think of this slave trade from 16th century Sierra Leone in the same ways that we think of an Angola wave later on in the 17th century. Based on slave trade data. At least 15 to 20 years before Luanda was founded, Iberians took advantage of social and political turmoil in Sierra Leone to enslave war captives and refugees, probably, resulting in a surge. What we know happened was there was a surge of forced migration from Sierra Leone to the Cape Verde Islands, the Canary Islands, to Cacheo in present-day Guinea-Bissau, and to various sites in the Spanish Caribbean. While scholarship on the Canary Islands has not yet been fully integrated into sort of the big picture accounts of the early transatlantic slave trade, the Canaries were doubly important in that, first, slaving voyages that would eventually take captives elsewhere were organized there. And secondly, notarial records in the Canaries contain information, beginning in the early 1500s, of enslaved Africans who were brought to those islands. In accordance with terms stipulated in the 1479 Treaty of Alcáçovas, in which Isabel, the Queen of Spain, was acknowledged as the ruler of Castile, actually. The Canaries were held to be Castilian possessions. But Portugal alone would enjoy the right to engage in maritime activity south of nearby Cape Bojador on the coast of what's today the Western Sahara. But mariners and merchants based in Andalusia and in the Canaries began to disregard the terms of this treaty in short order. Throughout the 16th century, residents of the Canary Islands not only traded with neighboring Portuguese settlements such as the Cape Verdes, but also regularly traded for slaves at points along the entire western coastline. of Africa. In Sierra Leone, Spanish or Canarian traders were not far behind the Portuguese and Cape Verdeans, launching slaving voyages from Gran Canaria, and especially Tenerife, in the late 1550s and 1560s. For example, we have notarial records in which merchants based in the Canaries hired sailors and sometimes interpreters who would be in charge with going ashore to actually procure captives. And some of these individuals they hired and who appear in notarial records in the Canaries were tangomaos, who've been kind of elusive figures in pre-colonial African history. In one case, I think we're going to be able to turn up the last will of a tangomao, among other things. Manuel Lobo Cabrera's samples of Las Palmas notarial records found at least 50 captives in Las Palmas and in the island of Gran Canaria from Magarabomba, essentially referring to a region in southern Sierra Leone, during the 1560s and early 1570s. So this is a snippet from a chart from Lobo Cabrera's monumental and excellent book. Now, building on his work, Mark Eagle and I have begun to find additional cases pointing to an influx of captives from Magarabomba beginning a little bit earlier in the late 1550s. So here's an example of a case that one individual that Lobo Cabrera missed, basically, in his sample. Although the toponym Magarabomba very rarely appears in Spanish Caribbean sources, in the Caribbean, right, many African migrants to 16th century Spanish America were described as Zapes or Sapis. Early modern Iberians may have drawn some distinction between these two terms, but I suspect that both Sape and Magarabomba were broad umbrella terms referring to diverse peoples exported from Sierra Leone. Sapes in the Caribbean were often described secondary ethnonyms, too, that can be matched with modern West African peoples, such as Baga, Kokoli, and Susu. Additional terms such as Bulum, Landuma, Loco, Yalonga appear as well, although less frequently in Caribbean sources. See Mark Eagle back there, just want to say hello. While slave ships departing from the Cape Verde Island, here's an example from Havana. So here's a baptismal record from a bit later, from the 1590s in Havana, where you can see a couple of people described as Sape in the source. Sape spelled with a C and a little sort of cedilla. While slave ships departing from the Cape Verdes also delivered enslaved Sapes to Caribbean ports such as Cartagena, Veracruz, and Havana in the 16th century, and occasionally afterwards in the 17th century, especially in Cartagena. Several voyages sailed directly from La Sierra Leona or Magarabomba during the 1560s, roughly coinciding with the alleged Mane invasions, or perhaps the years immediately following. So here's some of the ports, 1630 map with some of the ports, it's maybe too small to make up, with some of the ports we've been looking at and finding evidence of either Sapes or ships arriving from Sierra Leone in the Caribbean. The slave ship cargo master Cristobal Rodriguez Garrucho disembarked at least 77 enslaved Africans in Ocoa Española in 1562. Nearly twice as many captives arrived in San Germán, Puerto Rico, on a different ship, the San Anton, owned by an individual named Pedro Rodriguez, the following year. Both of these vessels, 1562 and 1563, were said to have departed in some sources from the rivers of Guinea and other sources, more specifically, from Magarabomba. Other ships transported captives from Magarabomba to Nisao, Española, in 1564, or from Sierra Leone to Guayama and Puerto Rico in 1566. One of the best documented transatlantic slave trade voyages to have taken place at any point before 1580 was that of the navío, the ship, Nuestra Señora de la Victoria, Maestre Francisco Rodriguez. Extant primary sources for this single voyage consist of over 1,000 manuscript pages spread across 5 separate legajos in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. And Toby Green has done some excellent work in one of these legajos. I'd like to also acknowledge, again, the tremendous amount of work Mark Eagle has put into transcribing and analyzing some of this copious and often very difficult source material. And I have a different slide I didn't show today where I show one of the sources of a list of captives that Mark transcribed. It just looks like someone died on the page. It looks horrible. And another one I found a verbatim copy of the same source that was it was almost like TypeScript. It was wonderful. And this months after Mark had already transcribed several, but over 100 pages of this source. The benefits of collaborative scholarly research. Extensive testimonies provided by, in the case of this voyage, with over 1,000 pages of manuscript material, extensive testimonies provided by the ship's cargo master, pilot, and other crew members reveal that the captives disembarked in Cartagena de Indias in late 1564 had been acquired in Sierra Leone. As in some of the other cases we've examined, mariners' testimonies indicate specific rivers and islands where they had purchased captives or stopped to take on water and provisions. Subsequently auctioned in Cartagena, nearly all of the captives were described as sapes or sosos. Others were listed as bolon or bolum, and about 15 were ascribed other Upper Guinean ethnonyms. So moving on, in addition to potentially providing new insights into the Mane invasions described by Almada, sources generated in the Canaries and the Caribbean regarding the slave trade from Sierra Leone neatly illustrate how specific episodes of slave trafficking produced diasporic African populations who were then used to prop up Iberian expansion in different areas. This happened at what we now recognize as critically important moments in Iberian expansion on both sides of the Atlantic, as I said. So here's same map, other side of the ocean. As Maria Manuel Torao has argued, Iberian slave trafficking in Upper Guinea was primarily routed through the Cape Verde Islands for most of the 16th century. In the 1580s, this trade was overtaken by direct slave trade voyages from the Upper Guinean mainland, especially from Cacheo, where she's focused on. Records of slave ship arrivals in the Spanish Caribbean confirm this trend, but we can add two further details to this observation. First, this shift from the Cape Verde Islands to the Upper Guinean mainland as a source of slaving voyage and slaving networks may have begun with voyages sailing directly from Sierra Leone to the Caribbean in the 1560s. Secondly, the resettlement of Zapes near Cacheo around the same time period may have contributed to the establishment of a base for Atlantic-oriented slave trafficking on the Upper Guinean mainland. As George Brooks has noted, Sape refugees comprised a significant percentage of the so-called Portuguese population of Cacheo, which was in fact a town within the Bram state of Cacanda. Missionary reports from a slightly later period describe the Sapes near Cacheo, and Cacheo is well north, right, of Sierra Leone, as being very Catholic and exceedingly loyal to the Portuguese. So as I've argued for the Caribbean in later decades, Africans played ambiguous yet critically important roles as surrogate settlers, sustaining Iberian colonization in 16th century context. The rise of Cacheo occurred at roughly the same time Spanish authorities were implementing new policies for the Caribbean, namely the new Indies fleet system, beginning in the 1560s. So later on in the 17th century, Cartagena de Indias and Havana experienced this big surge of growth that corresponded to this rapid increase and massive increase in the slave trade, especially from Angola, along with other places. But that period of expansion built on structures that had been established earlier during previous decades, and in the 1560s, notably by this wave of migrants from Sierra Leone. So I have some other questions I'll skip over. One thing I'm interested in now is comparing voyages that carried sapes from the Cape Verde Islands to the Caribbean to those that were leaving directly from Sierra Leone after the 1560s, right? So you have mariners on voyages who were, working on the slave ships, some enslaved, some free, who were described as Creoles from the Cape Verde Islands, and others who were described as sapes. So I think, again, Sierra Leone also provides, again, this is just one of the questions I was going to bring. Sierra Leone provides some really interesting material for thinking about Stephanie Smallwood's article on African slave ship guardians, for example, among other things. So again, I hate to do it, I'm skipping stuff. So last thing I was going to bring up, back to the Canary Islands. In addition to bringing captives from Sierra Leone and elsewhere back to the Canaries, during the 1560s, the Canary Islands received captives from not only received captives from Sierra Leone, but also served as staging grounds for slaving voyages to the Caribbean. To illustrate this, in 1565, a Portuguese ambassador in Madrid complained that for the past 10 years, right, again, late 1550s, 1560s, residents of the Canary Islands had been flouting this treaty of Alcáçovas established much earlier, evidently well informed by agents who had been based in Tenerife since at least 1560. The ambassador cited the names, this is a Portuguese ambassador in Madrid, 1565, he cites the names of nearly 30 individuals who had been organizing or participating in unauthorized slaving voyages, right? These are people who were residents of Tenerife. So he lists at least 30 people by name. At least, and we can confirm a lot of them were doing exactly this. At least 14 of them appear in a list of Tenerife notarial records preparing voyages to the African mainland during the 1550s and 1560s, several of which were going to Sierra Leone. And furthermore, as it turns out, at least some of these Tenerife to Sierra Leone voyages actually ended up not going back to the Canaries, but disembarking captives in the Spanish Caribbean. So two of the voyages I mentioned earlier by Garucho and Pedro Rodriguez were among these, right? And one of them was actually originally listed in Tenerife notarial records as part of an armada that was going to trade on the Upper Guinea coast. So there's probably a lot more going on here too. The Canarian connection to Sierra Leone was not over yet. Gaspar de Argijo, a native of Tenerife, who later becomes a very important person in Seville, financed a slaving voyage from Sierra Leone to Puerto Rico in 1566. As late as 1567, Tenerife records still are providing evidence of local residents mounting expeditions to the coast of Guinea to quote, purchase black slaves from the Christian merchants who were on that coast. One of the voyages of this 1567 voyage's main financial backers was the chief constable of the capital of Tenerife. So to conclude, well before the rise of Cacheu and Luanda in West and West Central Africa, and before the rise of Cartagena and Veracruz and Buenos Aires as major slaving ports in the 17th century Americas, these slaving networks based in the Cape Verde Islands, the Canary Islands, and Sao Tome, which is, I didn't get to talk about that, converged in Sierra Leone, particularly in the late 1550s, 1560s, and then fanning outwards to the Caribbean, to Cacheu, back to the Canary Islands, and possibly elsewhere that we don't know about yet. In addition to emphasizing the special importance of a Zape or Magarabomba diaspora in the 1550s and 60s, we can treat this episode in the slave trade from Sierra Leone as an illustrative case, and perhaps a precedent, for overlapping slaving networks that evolved, fed into, and sometimes competed with one another, linking Iberian colonies, establishing new Iberian settlements and commercial hubs, and reinforcing Iberian expansion, while at the same time flouting, circumventing, or simply preempting a metropolitan legislation and priorities. Thank you.
These have been 5 very interesting, very rich papers, and I want to thank all 5 panelists and Joe for Dale for presenting them. It's late, but if they're willing, I think we could at least entertain one round of questions, if anybody wants to. Are there questions, or are we all sort of heading to the bar? Or bed, depending on your time zone. Well, if there aren't, I want to thank Tyler for organizing this panel and for inviting me to chair it. And once again, to thank our five wonderful panelists for their very interesting papers. Thank you.